There is a specific kind of medical condition that dentists call hyperdontia. It is the presence of extra teeth beyond the standard 32 that a normal adult human develops. It is documented, it is real, and in living patients today it is manageable. A child grows a double row of teeth along the lower jaw, the extra set gets removed, and life continues. Pediatric dentists see it occasionally. It makes the news sometimes as a curiosity. Parents bring their children in, the extra teeth come out, and the story ends there. But that is not what keeps appearing in the archaeological record. What keeps appearing across burial sites, excavation reports, and historical accounts spanning multiple continents and several centuries is something that does not fit neatly into the hyperdontia explanation. The cases being documented are not children with a manageable dental anomaly. They are skeletal remains of adults, described repeatedly by excavators, anthropologists, and field reporters as having two complete and fully developed rows of teeth, set in skulls that are themselves described as unusually large, double the standard width in some accounts, with jawbones that field workers noted required more than one person to hold. That combination skull size, jaw structure, and the double row formation appearing together, consistently, across sites that have no geographic or cultural connection to each other is what makes this worth examining carefully. To be clear about what this video is and is not doing. This is not an attempt to prove a theory. It is an attempt to look closely at a pattern that shows up with enough frequency and enough consistency across enough independent sources that dismissing it without examination would itself be a choice, and not a particularly well-reasoned one. The pattern exists in the record. What it means is a separate question entirely, and that question will be treated with the seriousness it deserves. The double row formation, when it appears in living patients today, is almost always found in children, almost always involves a single additional tooth or a small cluster, and almost always affects one section of the jaw rather than the full arch. The condition resolves. The skeletal remains being referenced in historical excavation accounts do not describe anything that resembles the clinical presentation of standard hyperdontia. They describe full duplicate arches. They describe the condition appearing in remains that are otherwise proportioned far outside the normal range for the human skeleton. That distinction matters. It matters because if the remains being described were simply cases of hyperdontia, they would not stand out. Hyperdontia has been documented across human populations for as long as dentistry has kept records. It would not prompt field notes. It would not generate letters to scientific institutions. It would not appear in newspaper accounts written by people who clearly felt they were reporting on something they had not encountered before and did not have an adequate framework to explain. And yet those letters exist. Those field notes exist. Those newspaper accounts exist. They come from different decades, different countries, different excavation contexts. Some come from formally trained archaeologists operating within academic institutions. Some come from farmers who broke ground on land they had owned for years and found something underneath that stopped their work entirely. Some come from surveyors, from road crews, from people with no scientific training and no apparent motivation to fabricate or exaggerate what they were looking at. The consistency is not in the storytelling. The consistency is in the specific physical details that keep appearing across accounts that could not have influenced each other. The double rows. The jaw dimensions. The overall skull width. The depth of the eye sockets in some accounts. The density of the bone noted by those who handled the remains. That is the starting point. Not a conclusion. Not a claim. A pattern that shows up across independent sources and deserves to be looked at without either immediate dismissal or immediate dramatic interpretation. What follows in this video is an attempt to do exactly that, to go through what has been physically described, what has been formally documented, what the historical context was at the time these discoveries were made, and where the explanations currently available either hold up or fall short. The record is incomplete. That is itself a fact worth examining. When excavation accounts describe skeletal remains outside the normal human range, the details that appear most consistently are not vague. They are specific, they are measurable in nature even when formal measurements were not taken, and they repeat across accounts in ways that suggest the observers were describing real physical objects rather than constructing a narrative. We are investigating the timeline they tried to erase. If you want to see the documents I found next video, make sure to subscribe. Start with scale. The normal adult human skull measures roughly 15 centimeters in length and about 12 to 13 centimeters in width. These are well-established baselines. Forensic anthropologists work from them routinely when assessing remains. The accounts being examined here describe skulls that witnesses and excavators estimated at roughly double the standard width in some cases, or describe the jaw as large enough that a grown man could place it over his own face like a mask. That description appears in more than one account, from more than one location, written by people who were apparently using that comparison because it was the most immediate way to communicate the scale of what they were holding. That is not a vague description. It is a spatial comparison. A human jaw held over a human face is a measurable act, and the fact that it appears in multiple independent accounts as a way of conveying scale is significant not because it proves anything, but because it demonstrates that multiple observers independently reached for the same kind of physical reference point to describe what they were seeing. The teeth themselves are described with similar specificity. Not as slightly enlarged. Not as mildly irregular. As fully formed, fully developed, set in double rows running the length of the jaw. Upper and lower. Front to back. In several accounts, the excavators note that the teeth were intact, firmly set, and showed the kind of wear patterns that develop over years of use. This is relevant because wear patterns require time. A tooth that shows wear has been in use. 2 complete rows of teeth showing wear patterns is not a developmental accident caught early. It is a feature that persisted through what would have been the full life of the individual. In 1833, workers in Cheltenham, Ohio, uncovered skeletal remains during the preparation of a burial mound. The remains were documented as significantly larger than standard human proportions and included a jaw described as double-rowed. The account was published locally and later referenced in regional historical records. The bones were described as well preserved at the time of discovery, which would have made physical examination straightforward for anyone present. They were not sent to a formal institution for analysis. The record of what ultimately happened to the remains is incomplete. In the 1880s, the Smithsonian Institution was actively funding mound excavation across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys as part of the Bureau of Ethnology's systematic survey of prehistoric North American sites. The reports generated by that survey are extensive, and in many cases meticulous. Field workers were recording dimensions, burial orientation, associated artifacts, and skeletal condition in considerable detail. Within those reports, and in the wider body of newspaper coverage that followed excavation activity during that period, accounts of oversized remains and double-rowed teeth appear with a frequency that is difficult to attribute entirely to exaggeration or misidentification. A report from Brush Creek Township in Muskingum County, Ohio, describes remains uncovered from a mound that local farmers had known about for years. The account, published in a regional newspaper in the late 19th century, describes a skull of unusual dimensions and teeth arranged in double rows. The writer notes that several men present examined the skull and that the double formation was confirmed by multiple observers before the remains were moved. This is a pattern worth pausing on. Accounts with multiple witnesses. Accounts where the observers are named or at least identified by occupation or location. Accounts where the physical details are described with enough precision that they would have been immediately falsifiable by anyone who had actually been present and seen something different. There are also accounts from outside North America. In Wisconsin, in Indiana, in Illinois, in Georgia, mound sites across a geographic range that spans the entire eastern interior of the continent, similar descriptions appear. The consistency of the physical details across that range is notable because the accounts were not produced by a single author or a single institution with a consistent editorial voice. They came from local newspapers, from county histories compiled decades after the fact by local historians drawing on interviews and earlier records, and from private correspondence that was never intended for publication. Moving to skeletal proportion beyond the skull. Several accounts describe the long bones, the femur in particular, as substantially larger than the standard human range. A normal adult femur averages roughly 45 to 48 centimeters in length. Accounts describing remains estimated at 7, 8, or in some cases beyond 8 feet in height would require femur lengths significantly beyond that range. The double-rowed dental feature appears repeatedly in the same accounts that describe these overall proportions, which raises a question about whether these features were part of a consistent skeletal profile rather than isolated anomalies appearing separately. The physical evidence, taken strictly as description, presents a recurring set of features: unusual skull width, double-rowed teeth in fully developed form with wear patterns, and long bone proportions consistent with overall body height well beyond the standard human range. These features appear together, across multiple sites, across multiple decades, described by multiple independent observers who had no apparent connection to each other. That is what the physical record shows. What was done with that physical record, who examined it, who catalogued it, who retained it, and where it went is where the documentation becomes considerably more complicated. The physical descriptions are only part of what exists in the record. What surrounds those descriptions, the institutional responses, the newspaper coverage, the correspondence between field workers and academic bodies, and the notable silences in the official literature, forms a separate layer of evidence that is worth examining on its own terms. Begin with the newspaper record. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century and into the early 20th, regional American newspapers were among the most reliable first response documents for local archaeological discoveries. They were not academic publications and they did not apply peer review standards, but they were also not producing content for a national audience with a stake in any particular narrative. A county newspaper in Ohio or Indiana reporting on bones found during a farm excavation was, in most cases, simply reporting what local people had seen and said. The audience was local. The motivation to fabricate was low. The details were the kind that local readers could, in theory, go and verify themselves. The volume of such reports is substantial. Researchers who have gone back through 19th century newspaper archives, many of which are now digitized and searchable, have found accounts of oversized skeletal remains and anomalous dental features running into the hundreds across multiple states. These are not clustered around a single period or a single region. They span decades and they appear across a geographic range that covers most of the eastern United States. What is notable is not just the volume. It is the specific details that repeat. The jaw held over a living man's face as a size comparison. The double rows described as fully formed rather than partially developed. The association with burial mounds rather than isolated graves. The presence of multiple witnesses who are named or identified. These details repeat in accounts that were produced independently, in different states, in different decades, by writers who had no evident knowledge of each other's work. The Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology's Mound Survey, conducted primarily between 1881 and 1894 under Cyrus Thomas, produced a substantial body of field documentation. The published summary report, released in 1894, is a significant document in American archaeology. It catalogued thousands of mounds, described burial contents in considerable detail, and made formal arguments about the people who built them. What the report does not do, in a way that researchers have noted, is engage substantively with the accounts of anomalous remains that were circulating in the newspaper record and in private correspondence from the same period and the same geographic areas being surveyed. That absence is not proof of anything. Institutional reports make choices about what to include and what to set aside. A formal archaeological survey is not obligated to address every local newspaper account. But the volume of such accounts, and their geographic overlap with the survey area, makes the absence of engagement worth noting as an area where the official record and the popular record diverge without explanation. There is also the question of what happened to the physical remains. This is where the documentation becomes genuinely thin. Accounts that describe discovery, that name witnesses, that provide location details specific enough to be traceable, many of them end without any account of where the remains went. Some describe bones being sent to the Smithsonian. Some describe local retention by the landowner or by a local historical society. Some describe reburial. A portion describe the remains simply being lost or dispersed without any formal record of their disposition. The Smithsonian's own records from this period are extensive but not complete. Accession records from the late 19th century do document the receipt of skeletal material from mound excavation sites across the Midwest. What those records do not always provide is a clear chain of custody connecting specific field accounts to specific accessions, or a documented record of what subsequent analysis, if any, was performed on the material received. In 1947, a researcher named George Rockwell published a compilation of newspaper accounts and field records relating to giant skeletal finds in North America. The compilation drew on sources dating back to the early 19th century and covered accounts from multiple states. It was not a peer-reviewed academic work, and its sourcing was uneven, but it assembled in one place a body of primary source material that had previously been scattered across local archives and newspaper files. The work has been cited by subsequent researchers and has also been criticized for including accounts that cannot be independently verified. That tension between a body of material that is too voluminous and too consistent to dismiss wholesale, and a body of material that is too inconsistently documented to accept without scrutiny is precisely where the historical record currently sits. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: there exists a substantial and geographically distributed body of 19th and early 20th century documentation, produced by independent observers across multiple decades, describing skeletal remains with features including double-rowed teeth that fall outside the normal human range. There also exists an institutional record that does not engage with this material in proportion to its volume. And there exists a disposition record for the physical remains themselves that is, in many cases, incomplete in ways that make independent verification difficult. Those are the facts of the historical record. What they mean is a question that the available documentation does not answer. To understand what was happening with these discoveries and why the institutional response looks the way it does, it is necessary to understand the environment in which archaeology was being practiced in 19th century America, because that environment was not neutral, and the assumptions embedded in it shaped what got recorded, what got studied, and what got set aside. American archaeology in the latter half of the 19th century was operating inside a specific intellectual framework. The dominant question driving mound research was not simply what was in the mounds. It was who built them. And behind that question was a set of cultural and political pressures that had very little to do with dispassionate scientific inquiry. The prevailing popular belief through much of the early 19th century was that the mounds of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys had been built by a vanished race, a civilization that predated and was distinct from the Native American peoples living in the region at the time of European contact. This idea, sometimes called the mound builder myth, served a specific cultural function. If the mounds had been built by a separate, now extinct people, then the land on which they stood was not the ancestral homeland of living indigenous nations. It was, in this framework, simply territory that had changed hands before, which made it easier to justify changing hands again. The Smithsonian's Mound Survey, and Cyrus Thomas's 1894 report, was in part a deliberate effort to dismantle that myth on scientific grounds. Thomas's conclusion that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of living Native American peoples was correct, was well supported by the evidence he gathered, and represented a genuine advance in the field. It was also, politically, a conclusion that the institutional establishment had reasons to reach and to establish firmly. In that context, anomalous remains that did not fit the standard skeletal profile of any known population, remains that carried features unusual enough to invite speculation about distinct or unknown peoples were not simply inconvenient scientifically. They were potentially disruptive to a narrative that the institution had invested considerable effort in constructing and defending. This is not an accusation of deliberate suppression. It is a description of the way institutional priorities shape what gets emphasized and what gets minimized in any large research program. The Bureau of Ethnology was not a neutral scientific instrument operating in a vacuum. It was a human institution with funding pressures, political context, and intellectual commitments that influenced the questions it asked and the answers it was prepared to accept. At the same time, the popular press was operating with its own set of pressures. Regional newspapers in the 19th century were competitive commercial enterprises. Unusual discoveries sold papers. There was genuine incentive to report anomalous findings, to seek out witnesses, and to frame local discoveries as significant and remarkable. This does not mean the accounts were fabricated, but it does mean they were produced within a context that rewarded the remarkable and that did not always apply rigorous standards of verification. The scientific community of the period was also navigating the early stages of what would become physical anthropology as a formal discipline. The tools for measuring, categorizing, and interpreting skeletal remains were being developed in real time. Standards that are now routine precise cranial measurements, formal documentation protocols, chain of custody procedures for excavated material were not uniformly applied in the field during the peak period of mound excavation. This means that even accounts produced in good faith by trained observers may reflect measurement methods or descriptive conventions that would not meet current standards. The combination of these factors, institutional priorities that did not favor anomalous findings, a popular press that was not applying scientific standards, and a professional discipline that had not yet established uniform field protocols created conditions in which a genuine physical anomaly, if one existed, could move through the documentary record without receiving the kind of systematic examination that would either confirm or conclusively rule it out. That is the context. It explains some of the gaps in the record without explaining all of them, and it frames the period without either excusing the institutional response or condemning it. After working through the physical descriptions, the historical documentation, and the context in which both were produced, what remains is a set of questions that the available record does not answer. These are not rhetorical questions designed to lead toward a predetermined conclusion. They are genuine areas where the evidence is either incomplete, inconsistent, or simply absent in ways that make definitive interpretation impossible with what currently exists. The first question is about the physical remains themselves. If the accounts are accurate, and many of them come from named witnesses, published sources, and formally documented excavations, then the bones they describe should be traceable. Some of them were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian. Some were retained locally. Some were reburied. The question of where they are now, or what happened to them if they no longer exist, is not a question that has been answered with the specificity the volume of accounts would seem to warrant. Incomplete accession records and undocumented dispositions are not proof that material was concealed. They are, however, an area where the institutional record falls short of what the documentary trail would lead a researcher to expect. The second question is about the dental feature specifically. Standard hyperdontia, as it presents clinically today, does not produce the formation described in the historical accounts. A full duplicate arch, fully developed, with wear patterns consistent with extended use, is not the same condition as a child presenting with one or two supernumerary teeth in a single section of the jaw. If the accounts are describing something real, it is not adequately explained by the clinical literature on hyperdontia as currently understood. That does not mean it is inexplicable. It means the explanation has not yet been provided in terms that account for the specific features being described. The third question is about the geographic distribution. The accounts span the eastern United States, with concentration in the Ohio and Mississippi Valley regions, but with outliers in states as far apart as Wisconsin and Georgia. If these accounts were the product of exaggeration, regional folklore, or the kind of tall-tale tradition that runs through American popular culture, one might expect them to cluster around specific storytelling communities or to echo recognizable narrative templates. What they actually show is a distribution that follows the geography of mound sites, the same sites that produced the most intensive formal archaeological activity of the 19th century. That correspondence between the distribution of anomalous accounts and the distribution of known archaeological activity is a pattern that deserves examination rather than assumption. The fourth question is about the institutional silence. The Bureau of Ethnology was systematic. It was thorough in the areas it chose to be thorough in. The absence of formal engagement with the anomalous accounts circulating in the same geographic areas during the same period is not self-explanatory. It may reflect a reasonable decision to focus on what was scientifically tractable and to set aside accounts that could not be verified. It may reflect something else. The record does not say, and the absence of an explanation for that absence is itself a gap worth acknowledging. None of these questions point in a single direction. They do not, taken together, constitute evidence for any specific theory about what the remains represent, who the individuals were, or why the documentation looks the way it does. What they constitute is a set of areas where the standard account that the anomalous reports were exaggerations, misidentifications, or folklore has not been tested against the evidence with the rigor that the volume and consistency of the accounts would seem to require. That is the honest position the record supports. This video has not argued that giants existed. It has not argued that the Smithsonian suppressed evidence. It has not argued that the double-row dental formation represents a lineage unknown to current science. What it has done is go through what the documentary record actually shows: the physical descriptions, the historical sources, the institutional context, and the gaps, and note that the standard dismissal of this material has not been accompanied by a systematic engagement with the primary sources. The subject remains open. The accounts exist. The pattern is real in the sense that it genuinely appears across independent sources. What the pattern means, whether it reflects a real physical anomaly, a failure of 19th century documentation standards, a cultural storytelling tradition that spread further than scholars have tracked, or something else entirely, is a question the current record cannot answer. The purpose here is not to tell you what to conclude. It is to show you what exists, lay out the questions the evidence raises, and leave the analysis where it belongs with the person looking at it carefully and thinking it through. That is what the record invites. That is where this ends.